Good morning, everyone. I'm Diane from Pleasant Hill United Methodist Church, and this is my adult Sunday school lesson for this wonderful Sunday morning. Thanks for joining me today. We're going to talk about the book of Esther, one of my favorite books of the Bible, and we're looking specifically at Esther 3 through 7 today. Now, as a person, what number would you give yourself on a risk scale? Is your tolerance of risk really low, like you never leave home without an umbrella, you only ride a merry-go-round when you go to amusement parks, and you stay away from the roller coasters? Or you like to be in control of the situation, you like to plan things out so you know exactly what's going to be happening and where you're going when you go on a trip. You like a guaranteed outcome. Or is your tolerance risk really high? You go skydiving, you are daring, exciting, and unpredictable, and you're fine with absolutely no control over any situation and no guarantee. Think about that for just a moment. Well, it's impossible to follow Jesus and play it safe. When you choose to follow Jesus, you are no longer leading because Jesus is. And the essence of the Christian life is dependency on God and unconditional love for others. And both of these things involve personal risk. After Moses' death, God speaks to Joshua, the new leader of the Israelites. And in Joshua 1:6, God says, "Be strong and courageous." In Joshua 1, verse 7, God says, "Be strong and courageous." And in Joshua 1, verse 9, God says, "Be strong and courageous. Do not be terrified. Do not be discouraged. The Lord will be with you wherever you go." Now, why did God repeat this so many times? Because the journey that they were going to take would have risks and surprises, and this journey was not guaranteed safe. God was telling Joshua to depend on him, his presence, and his power. And the temptation is very great to ask God for a risk-free Christian life. But let me tell you, there's no such thing. A lot of people think, well, how can a bad thing happen to that person because they're a Christian? There is no risk-free life for anyone. And this is a lesson that Esther learned. In this Esther Bible study today, we're going to discover two aspects about Esther's dependence on God. Number one, Esther's dependence on God came from her confidence in God's providential guidance. And the book of Esther tells one story. Let's quickly review those first 3 chapters of Esther so that we can set the stage for this discussion today. You're welcome to put me on pause and go back and read those first 3 chapters if you would like. Well, at this point in history, many of the Jewish people were living in exile in the land of Persia. The king was Xerxes, or Arahus, and after becoming angry with his wife, Xerxes set out to choose a new queen. And after a long process, Esther was chosen. She was a Jew, but this was unknown to the king and to the other palace officials. Esther was an orphan, but she had a cousin, Mordecai, who was her guardian. So let's read now together Esther chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. After these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than that of all the other nobles. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down and would not pay him honor. Then the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" Day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated, for he had told them he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet, having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. Well, what was Haman's biggest sin here? It was pride. He wanted everybody to bow down to him. He had the top government official job. He was the king's right-hand man. He had enormous wealth. He had prestige. He had power. But it wasn't enough because Mordecai would not bow down to him. And so when Mordecai didn't, Haman decided not only to kill Mordecai, but to kill all of Mordecai's people. Now, Proverbs 6:16 through 19 gives a really great picture of Haman. There are 6 things that the Lord hates, 7 that are detestable to him: haughty eyes, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked schemes, feet that are quick to rush into evil, a false witness that pours out lies, and a man who stirs up dissension among brothers. Now, Haman, with the king's blessing, made a proclamation that on the 13th day of the 12th month, all the Jews in the kingdom would be killed. And that would probably have been about 15 million Jews. Haman was putting together a decree that would put to death 15 million Jews because one man would not bow down to him. Let's continue reading. We're going to read Esther chapter 4, verses 1 through 11. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. And every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning amongst the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's eunuchs and female attendants came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him and to put on instead of his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. Also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which he had published in Susa, to show Esther and explain it to her. And he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, "All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king." So Mordecai is asking a lot of Esther. He's asking her to risk her life in order to save the Jews. Now, remember, they do not know at this point that Esther is also Jewish. Well, Mordecai began a period of mourning for his people. Esther found out what the problem is. And being the queen, she had limited access to the world beyond the palace, so she didn't know about what was going to happen in 11 months. But, however, even if she wants to help, she can't. Why? Because nobody can go into the king's presence without being invited. And to do so means almost certain death. The one exception is if the king holds out his scepter to the person, but Esther had not been invited to see the king for a whole month. Then Mordecai spoke these very wise words to Esther. "Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this." In Esther 4:13 through 14. Esther was challenged to depend upon God and his sovereignty. Perhaps God placed her in the palace to save the Jews, but she knows that if she acts, she is jeopardizing her own safety. Well, let's go into lesson 2 now from the Esther Bible study, and that is that Esther's dependence upon God led her to wise action, even though it involved risk. Esther answered with faith and with dependence upon God, "I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish," as recorded in Esther 4:16. Esther asked Mordecai to ask all the Jews to fast for 3 days, and she would have her maidservants do the same. Then she would approach the king. Esther wasn't going to rely on her own beauty or her influence or her persuasive powers. She was going to rely on God, and she believed that God was in control. Let's continue with the story. We're going to read Esther 5, verses 1 through 8. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom it will be given you." "If it pleases the king," replied Esther, "let the king, together with Haman, come today to a banquet I have prepared for him." "Bring Haman at once," the king said, "so we may do what Esther asks." So the king and Haman went to the banquet that Esther had prepared. As they were drinking wine, the king again asked Esther, "Now what is your petition? It will be given you. And what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." Esther replied, "My petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to a banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's questions." So on the third day, Esther goes to visit the king, and the king holds out his scepter to her. She is welcomed. She invites the king and Haman to a feast, and Haman was so happy to be favored by the king and queen. But then, as he left, he saw Mordecai, who still would not bow to him, and he became even more angry. He decided, with his wife's urgings, that he would hang Mordecai. At the feast, Esther requested the king and Haman come to a second feast, and in the ancient world, this was an even greater honor. At the second banquet, Esther then presented her wish to the king. Let's read Esther 7, 1 through 10. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet, and as they were drinking wine on the second day, the king again asked, "Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition, and spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king." King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, "Who is he? Where is he, the man who has dared to do such a thing?" And Esther said, "An adversary and an enemy, this vile Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. The king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king exclaimed, "Will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house?" As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, "A pole reaching to a height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house. He had it set up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king." The king said, "Impale him on it," and so they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai. And then the king's fury subsided. The king and Haman had no idea that Esther was a Jew, the race that had been marked to be slaughtered. In the end, Haman is hung on the gallows he prepared for Mordecai, and Mordecai is promoted to an official position, and the Jewish race is spared. Esther's dependence on God led her to act, and she trusted her safety to God. So to apply this to our lives, what does this Esther Bible study have anything to do with us in today's world? Well, our lives are governed by the same God. Following his resurrection, Jesus said, "As the Father sent me, I am sending you," in John 20:21. Every member of the body of Christ, there is a purpose, a plan, and a place. And none of us is a leading character in the story of our life. Like Esther, God has put you where you are for a reason. Now, the older I get, the more I have a sense of some things are meant to be. I simply mean that I am more aware of God's providential guidance. I see how God is governing my life and how he's arranging circumstances. And I realize that the Lord is going before me and preparing people for me and me for people. I experienced this several times in my life. There have got to be situations in your life that if you reflect back and if you look back and think about them, times when God put someone in your life in that moment when you needed them. Or maybe God put you on the path to someone else so that you arrived there at the moment when they needed you. This is God. This is God being in control of our lives and our world. And sometimes we forget about that. We think we're in control, but hey, we are not. Well, consider the people in your life. Many within your relational network are people that you routinely see every day. Could it be that God has brought you together with them for a reason? God often finds people in the middle of their daily routine. And when God is at work, doors open. At any time, God can guide us to someone who is searching. He can arrange events to get us where he wants us to be, even if we don't know that he's doing it. God puts us in the right place at the right time to say the right thing to the right person. Confidently dependent on God that he has put you where you are for such a time as this. Lives are at stake. And as we learn from the Esther Bible study, God's preparing his heroes, and when the opportunity comes, he can fit them into their places in a moment, and the world will wonder where they came from. That's a quote by A.B. Simpson. Well, thank you again to Paul Schleicher and BibleStudyLessonPlans.com for this lesson. Our Extraordinary Life Sunday School class. We'll be talking about this lesson tomorrow in a hybrid Sunday school class. They'll be in person in the fellowship hall, or if you would prefer instead to join them via Zoom, email me at programs@pleasanthillmethodist.org and I can send you the invite so that you can join them. Thanks for being with me today, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Bye-bye.